The most caring people in the world are also the most hunted. Not the weakest. Not the most broken. The most caring. And if you have spent years wondering why the people you loved the most seemed to leave you more damaged than when they found you, this is not a coincidence. This is not bad luck. This is not something wrong with you that needs to be fixed. It is something right about you that was never protected. There is a pattern happening beneath the surface of your relationships. A pattern so consistent, so precise, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The people who gave the most were the ones who lost the most. The ones who stayed the longest through the pain were the ones who suffered the deepest. The ones who tried the hardest to hold everything together were the ones who ended up holding nothing at all. You were not naive. You were not foolish. You were operating from a depth of feeling that most people never develop in a lifetime. You saw the best in people before they earned it. You stayed when others would have walked away. You carried what was never yours to carry, not because you were weak, but because something inside you genuinely believed that love was supposed to feel like sacrifice. That belief was never random. It was built carefully, quietly, over years. And certain kinds of people learned how to find it. This is not a video about villains. It is not about labeling people or placing blame on anyone from your past. This is something far more important than that. This is about understanding a mechanism, a pattern so deeply embedded in how empaths move through the world that most will live their entire lives inside it without ever realizing it exists. Because here is the truth that no one tells you. The same quality that makes you extraordinary is the exact quality that makes you a target. And the question worth sitting with, the one that changes everything once you answer it honestly, is this: what are you unconsciously showing the world that draws these people directly to you? It did not begin with the wrong relationship. It began much earlier than that. It began in a room where you learned, very young, that the emotional temperature around you mattered more than your own comfort. Where you discovered that paying close attention to how someone else was feeling could keep things calm, could keep things safe. Where you understood, before you had the words to explain it, that reading the room was not a social skill. It was a survival skill. You were not born sensitive in the way people casually use that word. You were not simply soft or emotional or easily moved. You were born with a nervous system that processed the world at a frequency most people never experience. You felt the shift in a room before anyone spoke. You sensed the tension behind a smile. You absorbed the emotions of the people around you the way dry earth absorbs rain, completely, and without any choice in the matter. And because you were young, and because no one explained what was happening inside you, you did the only thing that made sense. You adapted. You became the one who noticed, the one who adjusted, the one who softened their own needs so the people around them could remain stable. You learned to shrink the parts of yourself that made others uncomfortable and amplify the parts that made them feel safe. This was not a decision you made consciously. It was something your nervous system learned in the earliest chapters of your life, quietly and completely, the way a tree grows toward whatever light is available. By the time you were old enough to call it a personality, it had already become architecture. And so you moved through the world carrying this, feeling everything while appearing to feel nothing unusual, holding the weight of other people's unspoken pain while maintaining the surface appearance of being perfectly fine. You became fluent in a language no one taught you, the language of emotional subtlety, of reading what was not said, of knowing what someone needed before they asked, and offering it before they realized they were in need. This made you remarkable. It also made you exhausted in a way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has never felt it. Because the world does not stop. People do not stop carrying their emotions into every room they enter. And you do not get to turn off the part of you that receives all of it. So you learn to manage it, to smile through it, to say you were fine when you were quietly drowning in feelings that were not even entirely your own. This is the wound no one sees. Not because it is hidden intentionally, but because it does not look like damage from the outside. From the outside, it looks like warmth. It looks like patience. It looks like someone who is always there, always steady, always willing to listen. But on the inside, it feels like carrying a frequency that never quiets. Like walking into every room already full, and being asked to make space for everyone else anyway. What you developed was not weakness dressed up as kindness. It was an extraordinary form of emotional intelligence that formed under pressure, in conditions that required it. A wound that taught itself to function as a gift. A survival mechanism so refined that it eventually became the most defining thing about you. And that is precisely where the danger begins. There is a language being spoken beneath every interaction you have ever had. Not with words, not with tone, with something far more subtle than either of those things, with the way you hold yourself, the way you respond, the way your entire presence communicates something about who you are and what you will tolerate before you ever open your mouth. Most people are unreadable, not because they are mysterious or guarded in any intentional way, but because most people are simply not paying enough attention to the emotional world around them to project anything coherent. They move through life broadcasting noise, inconsistency, distraction. You are different. You project clarity. And that clarity, that extraordinary emotional transparency that makes you so deeply trustworthy to the right people, is the exact signal that draws the wrong ones directly to you. Here is what is actually happening beneath the surface. When a person has spent years learning to attune to the emotions of others, they develop what could be called an open emotional field. They make eye contact that holds longer than average. They respond to vulnerability with immediate warmth. They absorb tension from a conversation rather than deflecting it. They apologize instinctively, even when they are not wrong. They give explanations when none were requested. They extend patience far beyond the point where most people would have already walked away. To someone with genuine emotional depth, these signals read as safety, as connection, as the rare discovery of a person who actually sees them. To a manipulator, these same signals read as access. What predators? And that word is used deliberately, not dramatically. What predators are looking for is not someone who is broken. They are not drawn to obvious vulnerability the way people assume. They are drawn to high-functioning, emotional availability, to someone who will work to understand them, someone who will absorb blame without collapsing, someone who will stay in discomfort longer than is reasonable because their internal wiring insists that patience and love are the same thing. They are not looking for someone easy to break. They are looking for someone worth breaking, someone who will keep coming back, someone whose care is deep enough to survive repeated damage and still return with the same openness, the same warmth, the same willingness to try again. This is what readability means. It is not about being naive or having poor judgment. It is about being visible in a way that most people are not. Your emotional attunement, your genuine warmth, your inability to simply stop caring. These things are written across everything about you. In the way you engage, in the way you listen, in the way you never fully close the door, even when every rational thought is telling you that you should. And certain kinds of people have spent their lives learning to read exactly that signal. This is not your fault. That statement carries more weight than it may seem at first. Because somewhere along the way, you were made to believe that the repeated presence of harmful people in your life was evidence of a flaw in your character, a failure of judgment, a pattern that pointed back to something broken inside you. But the truth is more precise than that. You were not broken. You were unguarded. There is a profound difference between the two. A locked door that has been forced open is not evidence of a weak door. It is evidence of someone who wanted very badly to get inside. The signal you have been sending was never the problem. The problem was that no one ever taught you how to choose who deserved to receive it. There comes a moment, not always loud, not always dramatic, where something inside you simply stops. Not breaks. Stops. There is a difference. Breaking implies falling apart in a way that is visible, that makes noise, that demands immediate attention. What happens to an empath at their turning point is quieter than that, and far more devastating. It is the moment where the story you have been telling yourself, the one that explained everything, justified everything, made every sacrifice feel purposeful, suddenly no longer holds together. You look at the person in front of you, or perhaps you are alone, replaying a conversation for the 100th time, and something shifts. A clarity arrives that you did not ask for and cannot send back. And in that clarity, you see something you cannot unsee. Not that they were imperfect, not that the relationship was difficult, but that the fundamental thing you believed was there, the potential, the depth, the capacity for real love that you were so certain you saw, was never actually present in the way you needed it to be. This is a specific kind of grief. It does not have a clean name because most people have never felt it precisely. It is not the grief of losing someone. It is the grief of realizing that what you were grieving was never fully real to begin with, that the person you protected, defended, explained to others, made excuses for, and rebuilt yourself around, did not experience your relationship the way you did, that while you were giving everything, they were simply taking what was available. And the cruelest part of this realization is not the betrayal itself. It is the audit that follows. Because an empath does not simply absorb the pain and move forward. They go back. They review every moment through the new lens of what they now understand. They remember the times they felt something was wrong and talk themselves out of it. The moments they chose to believe the explanation over the feeling. The version of events they accepted because accepting the truth would have required them to stop trying. And stopping felt like failure. You stayed not because you were blind. You stayed because you were committed to a version of that person that lived primarily inside your own perception of them. You loved not who they consistently showed you they were, but who you believed they were capable of becoming. And that love, that patient, persistent, self-sacrificing love, was completely real. It simply was not returned with the same substance. That is the wound that does not heal quickly, not because you are too sensitive, but because you love too honestly to protect yourself from the full weight of what it means when that honesty is not matched. But here is where something important must be understood. This moment, this shattering, disorienting, grief-soaked moment of clarity, is not a breakdown. It only feels like one because everything you organized your emotional life around is being reorganized without your permission. What is actually happening is more significant than collapse. What is actually happening is that your system is finally, for the first time, refusing to accept a reality that was never true. The confusion you feel is not weakness. It is your intelligence catching up to what your emotions already knew. The pain is not evidence that you were wrong to love deeply. It is evidence that you are finally seeing clearly. Darkness, when it arrives with this kind of force, is rarely just destruction. More often, it is the pressure required to produce something that could not have existed without it. The empath who survives this moment does not come out the other side simply wounded. They come out fundamentally different in how they see, what they trust, and what they will never again be willing to trade away for the illusion of being needed. This is not the end of the story. This is the first honest page of it. For most of your life, your sensitivity moved in one direction, outward, always outward, toward the emotions of others, toward the unspoken needs in a room, toward the pain that no one else seemed to notice, but that you could feel as clearly as your own heartbeat. Your attention was trained, from very early on, to scan the external world for what needed to be felt, fixed, or carried. And you became extraordinarily good at it. So good that it felt less like a skill and more like simply the way you existed. But there is something you were never taught. Something that would have changed everything had someone placed it in your hands earlier. And it is this: the same sensitivity you have been directing outward your entire life is capable of being turned inward. Not reduced, not silenced, redirected. And when that redirection happens, everything changes. Discernment is not a personality trait you either have or do not have. It is not the cold detachment of someone who has stopped caring or the hardness of someone who has been hurt too many times to remain open. Discernment is a skill, a precise, learnable, practicable skill. And for an empath, it is not about developing something foreign to your nature. It is about applying the extraordinary capacity you already possess to the one area where it has always been most needed: yourself. Think about the difference between your old pattern and what becomes possible once this shift begins. The old pattern was absorption. Someone entered your life carrying pain, dysfunction, or need, and before you had consciously decided anything, you were already inside it with them, already feeling what they felt, already constructing explanations for their behavior, already positioning yourself as the thing that could help, heal, or stabilize them. You did not observe the situation from a distance and then choose to engage. You were engaged before you even realized the choice existed. The new awareness begins with a pause that the old version of you never took. Not a cold pause, not a suspicious or defensive one. Simply a moment of stillness in which you turn your attention inward before extending it outward. You ask not only what this person is feeling, but what you are feeling. Not only what they need, but what this dynamic is asking of you. Not only whether they are in pain, but whether their pain is something you can genuinely help or something they are expecting you to carry indefinitely in their place. This pause is not a wall. It is a filter. And learning to use it is perhaps the single most important transition in the life of an empath. Because over-explaining, that exhausting habit of justifying your feelings, your boundaries, your decisions, as though your inner world requires external approval to be valid, begins to lose its grip the moment you stop needing the other person to understand you in order for you to trust yourself. You stop rescuing not because you no longer care, but because you finally recognize the difference between someone who is drowning and someone who has simply decided they prefer the water and would like your company in it. You begin to observe before you absorb. To notice patterns across time rather than responding only to the moment directly in front of you. To register what someone's behavior tells you over weeks and months, rather than what their words tell you in a single conversation. Your sensitivity does not shrink in this process. If anything, it deepens. But for the first time, it is working in your service rather than being offered freely to whoever happens to need it most loudly. This is where your power begins. Not in becoming someone different, in finally becoming someone who uses what they have always had, with intention, with direction, and with themselves at the center of their own attention. Most people spend their lives trying to become less affected by the world around them. They build walls. They practice indifference. They mistake emotional distance for emotional strength, and they wear their detachment like armor, believing that the less they feel, the less they can be hurt. And, in a surface-level sense, this strategy works. It keeps certain kinds of pain at a manageable distance. But it also keeps everything else at that same distance. Depth, connection, perception, the rare ability to understand what is actually happening beneath what is being performed. You never had that wall. And for a long time, you believed that was the problem. It was not the problem. It was the beginning of something that most people never develop at all. Here is what becomes true for an empath who has moved through the pain, survived the awakening, and begun the work of turning their sensitivity inward. They develop a form of psychological perception that is genuinely rare. Not rare in the way people use that word casually, but rare in the way that fundamentally changes every interaction they enter. Because someone who has spent years feeling the emotional undercurrents of every room they walk into, who has learned to read the gap between what people say and what they actually mean, who has felt the precise texture of manipulation, guilt, false warmth, and performed vulnerability, that person becomes extraordinarily difficult to deceive. You cannot easily manipulate someone who has felt manipulation from the inside. You cannot destabilize someone who has already visited their own depths and returned. You cannot perform emotion convincingly for someone whose entire nervous system is calibrated to detect the difference between what is real and what is constructed. This is the weapon that was always hidden inside the wound. The sensitivity that once made you absorb everything indiscriminately is now, under your direction, the most sophisticated form of social intelligence available to a human being. And the people who once relied on your openness to gain access, who counted on your warmth, your patience, your compulsive need to understand them, find something entirely different when they encounter the version of you that has done this work. They find stillness. Stillness is perhaps the most underestimated form of power available to an empath. where you once responded immediately, explaining, defending, absorbing, appeasing. You now have the capacity to simply be still, to receive what someone is offering without immediately reacting to it, to let silence exist in a conversation without rushing to fill it with reassurance, to observe what happens when you do not perform the emotional labor that someone is clearly expecting from you. Stillness is not coldness. It is not punishment or withdrawal. It is the quiet demonstration that you no longer need to manage someone else's emotional discomfort at the expense of your own clarity. And for people who relied on your reactivity, who used your empathy as a lever to move you in whatever direction served them, your stillness is genuinely disorienting, because they built their entire approach around a version of you that no longer exists. Emotional regulation, in this context, does not mean suppressing what you feel. It means that your feelings are now information you process rather than impulses that direct you. You feel the pull of someone's need, and you choose your response rather than defaulting to it. You notice the familiar sensation of guilt being engineered, and you name it internally rather than acting from it automatically. You experience the discomfort of someone's displeasure, and you allow it to exist without treating it as an emergency that requires your immediate intervention. This is control of the deepest kind, not the control of someone who feels nothing, the control of someone who feels everything, and has learned that feeling something and being governed by it are two entirely different things. What was once your greatest vulnerability has become your most precise instrument. And the person who once looked at your sensitivity and saw an opening now looks at you and finds something they cannot easily read, cannot easily move, and cannot easily use. That is not hardness. That is mastery. There is a version of you that existed before all of this. That version loved without conditions and asked very little in return. That version believed that if they simply gave enough, stayed long enough, understood deeply enough, the people they chose would eventually rise to meet them. That version carried the weight of everyone around them and called it purpose, called it love, called it simply who they were, as though exhaustion and devotion were the same thing. That version was not wrong to exist. They were not foolish or broken or deserving of what found them. They were simply unfinished. And what followed? The pain, the awakening, the long and difficult work of understanding, was not punishment for being too open. It was the process of completion. The person who walks out of that fire is recognizably the same and fundamentally different in the same breath. They still feel deeply. That has not changed and will never change, because depth of feeling is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the architecture of who you are. But there is something different now in the way that feeling moves through them. Where it once moved immediately outward, rushing toward whoever needed it most, it now passes through something first. A quiet interior filter built from experience, from pain, from a hard-won knowledge of what happens when care is offered without discernment. The difference between who you were and who you have become is not measured in coldness. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about genuine transformation. The people who confuse emotional growth with emotional shutdown, who believe that protecting yourself requires becoming unreachable, have misunderstood the entire lesson. They traded one kind of damage for another. They stopped being hurt by closing the door entirely. And in doing so, they also stopped being fully alive. That is not what happened to you. What happened to you is something far more precise. You became calmer, not colder, calmer. There is a profound difference between the two that most people never get to understand from the inside. Coldness is distance. Calmness is stability. Coldness says nothing you do can reach me. Calmness says I can be reached, but I cannot be moved for myself. One is the absence of feeling. The other is the mastery of it. You now make choices where you once made sacrifices. You extend trust in measured doses rather than offering it wholesale to anyone who arrives with a compelling enough story. You recognize the familiar architecture of manipulation not with bitterness, but with a clarity that allows you to simply step aside rather than absorb the impact. You no longer require someone's understanding of your boundaries in order to maintain them. And perhaps most significantly, you have stopped shrinking. not in arrogance, not in self-importance, simply in the quiet, grounded refusal to make yourself smaller than you are in order to make someone else more comfortable with your presence. You take up the space you were always entitled to take up, and you do it without apology and without announcement. This is what power looks like when it belongs to someone who never lost their humanity in the process of finding it. Not loud, not aggressive, not defended by walls or performed through detachment. Simply present, rooted, unmovable, not because you feel nothing, but because what you feel no longer determines where you stand. The fire did not destroy you. It revealed you, and what it revealed was always worth protecting. Look back at everything you carried, not with pain this time, not with the familiar weight of wondering what you could have done differently, or who you might have been if certain people had never found you. Look back with the understanding that everything, the exhaustion, the betrayal, the long seasons of giving more than you received, the shattering moment of clarity, the slow and difficult work of rebuilding, every single part of it was forming something in you that cannot be taught in any other way. There are things you now know that most people will never know, not because they are less intelligent or less capable or less deserving of the understanding you have arrived at, but because this particular knowledge does not come from reading or reflection or even from years of lived experience in the ordinary sense. It comes specifically from the journey you have been on, from feeling everything and surviving it, from being targeted precisely because of your depth, and emerging from that experience with your depth not only intact, but sharpened into something far more precise than it was before. You understand people in a way that goes beyond observation. You understand the architecture of manipulation because you have felt it from the inside. You understand the difference between genuine vulnerability and performed need. You understand what it costs to love without boundaries, and you understand, finally, completely, that protecting yourself is not a betrayal of your sensitivity. It is the highest form of honoring it. This is not a small thing. This is the difference between a person who moves through the world and a person who truly sees it. If any part of this journey reflects your own, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it is content, but because somewhere someone is still in the middle of the fire and does not yet know that they will walk out of it. You were never too much. You were never the problem. You were never broken. You were simply being built for a life that required everything you went through to prepare you for it.